Hey friends, welcome to the Ultimate Paper Guide, where I'm going to share every tip that I've learned about making origami paper so that you can start folding complex models like this. This is going to be a multiple part series where I cover many topics such as how to treat your own paper, how to make two-colored paper, and even how to make super large ones. I'm going to cover the materials, the process, and even where to get some of these products so you can start making paper right away. So, boys, where do I get all these materials? Well, I have links for everything on my website, so go check that out, link in the description below. And before we talk about paper, let's talk about MC. I'm going to show you how I turned a powder into a usable form. And it's available in most places in the world, like South America, Europe, North America, Asia. So try to find it. It might be called CMC, but today we're using this MC. And let me show you how to do that. And the most common question I get is, boys, what's your ratio for MC? Honestly, I just eyeball it. This is kind of a smaller cup. Normally I use a little bit bigger, in which case I would do 2 scoops. Since it's a little bit smaller, I'm going to do 1.5. So give the first scoop just like a good scoop like that. And I'm just going to do a little bit more. And that's it. And the next step is to take your cup and fill it with hot water. It's going to be a lot easier to mix the MC in. Alright, we added our hot water. I didn't fill it all the way so I don't make a mess. And we're just going to give it a good mix, just like this. And once we're done mixing, the MC is distributed, but it's not going to gel quickly when it's hot. So I'm actually going to throw in a couple ice cubes. It's going to lower the temperature and allow the MC to gel. Some people like to put this in the refrigerator to cool it down. Or you could just leave it overnight, but it takes a little while. And we got our ice cubes, so just plop that in and let it cool down. Now, normally I just leave this overnight, but thankfully I have a completed batch to show you what it should look like. So this is my completed batch, and this is about the texture you want to treat paper and to even shape with. So it's relatively thick. It kind of clings onto my paintbrush, and that's how you know you're ready. So let's talk about our paper. Treating generally works best with handmade papers. This is Legion Paper's mulberry paper, one of my favorite papers to use. I think it's going to be a good example and a lot of fun to use. However, if you're trying things out and don't have handmade paper, just feel free to use single tissue. This is going to help you later for the next video, which will be double tissue. And before we treat the paper, I'm actually going to cut it into like 6-inch squares. And I recommend this for people who are new to treating paper, is to start small. Just use a small square to test. That way you can know you're practicing these processes correctly, or if your MC is thick enough. You know, don't waste the whole paper. Just use a little snippet like that, test it out, improve, and then commit to your full sheet. Alright, so I chopped my mulberry into about, actually 16 centimeters or a little bit over 6 inches by 6 inches. And that's because you need to start with a larger square. Then when you treat it, you have enough to cut out the square size you want. So if I wanted to cut out a 15 centimeter square or a 6-inch square, then I need to start a little bit larger. That way I can line it up with the cutting mat and chop my square nicely. Now, if you were treating a regular size paper, it's obviously not chopped up already. So it might take up the whole thing. That's totally fine too. This is just prep for some practice. And speaking of prep, let's go through the other prep steps you need to do before treating your paper. So, first thing we should do is actually roll our paper onto our pipe. So whatever thin or round surface you have, just roll it up tightly like this. This is going to help us to apply the paper back onto the surface when ready. So we can just put this to the side for now. And next, you might have noticed that my cutting board is pretty dirty. There's some leftover stain from previous treated tissue paper, and we need to get that all off so it doesn't ruin our new paper. And a little soap and water did the trick. Now, one thing I didn't mention yet is if you're using something like tissue paper where you have these creases running through, some people like to take a spray bottle and just spray it down before you roll it up into the pipe. I didn't do that on mine because I didn't need to, and I actually don't really like doing that, is it starts to warp the paper a little bit. But you can try it out for yourself, and if it works for you, that's good. The next preparation tip I have for you is really important. A lot of times while you're treating your paper, your hair falls out, and when the paper dries, you discover it. And then it's really hard to get out. So get yourself a hat, or I like to wear a beanie, and wear that while you treat your paper just to avoid your hair falling into it. So we are ready to treat our paper. Now remember, I'm doing around a 6 by 6 inch or 15 by 15 centimeter square. So I want to kind of block out in my memory where I'm going to roll that on my sheet. I'm going to do it around here, and this is where I'm going to actually just treat the surface of the cutting board first. And so we can take our MC, and we don't need a whole lot, so I'm just going to pour a little bit like that. That should be more than plenty. And then we have our paint roller, and I'm just going to roll that along the surface. I'm going to go a little over the 6 by 6 inch or 15 by 15 centimeter, kind of like I mentioned, in case I miss, or it just kind of helps. All right, and our surface is treated. You can't really tell since it's clear, but when I want to roll my paper on, again, I'm going to look at the grid lines on my cutting board just to line it up so that I can get the max square to cut out later. And that is going to be around here. Now when you actually roll it, it's not going to be quite stuck to the surface yet. So very gently, I'm going to place the roller down, and I'm going to kind of be pulling as I roll to make sure I get a flat surface and to make sure the paper doesn't kind of slide out under me. And just like that. And right after I apply the paper, I like to go back over it with the paint roller, which it doesn't have any new MC on it, but it's still a little bit wet from previous, and just kind of get the whole thing secured onto the sheet. And at this point, we can add some more MC. Now, imagine if this was a rectangle or a larger square. I like to pour from the middle and go outwards, and I also like to roll in only one direction, and this helps when you're pushing air bubbles, that if it gets trapped, it won't rip the paper. You know, some papers like tissue or Wenjo are a lot more delicate while you're applying the MC and while wet, so you want to be careful. So I've kind of decided to be rolling this way, and we're going to kind of stick to that as much as possible. You can see the paper is slightly lifting off the surface, so you got to be really careful while it's not fully stuck yet. But once it starts to soak in, the paper is pretty much going to stick to the surface. And now our paper is almost invisible. That's how you can tell it's been coated with MC enough. Now, if you do have some corners sticking out, you can go the other direction and just kind of start pushing out those air bubbles. But for the most part, once it's good to go, you don't want to mess with it too much. The paint roller will already help to eliminate air bubbles as you're pushing the MC through, and with a little bit of pressure, you can get most of them out. However, if you try to get all the air bubbles out now, there's a higher chance that you're going to rip the paper. So I like to wait around 5 to 10 minutes and then come back to push out the air bubbles. And that's where our plastic card is going to come and play. So let's wait for 5 or 10 minutes and come back. Alright, we are back around 10 minutes later, and obviously our paper's not dry yet, but you can kind of start to see some of the air bubbles popping through. So it's a little bit more dry and a little bit more durable. So it's kind of safe to start pushing out those air bubbles. And I'm going to grab my card, so it's just a plastic gift card, and just kind of go in any sort of direction to push these air bubbles out. Obviously you don't want to cross the whole thing, and you want to be kind of careful, but just start to see, right? If I just start to push a little bit of pressure, it starts clearing out these air bubbles, and it's really satisfying. Let's see if we can do like a half and half shot, so you can see some of the differences between pushed out air bubbles and not pushed out air bubbles. The other thing this helps do is if there's excess like MC on the top layer, it'll kind of pull it away, which also helps it dry. So a couple different bonuses to using our handy gift card here. Just make sure that you dry it off every so often in case the MC starts to build up. But if you take a really close look, maybe I can do something like this. You can see on the right side where we pushed out the air bubbles how much cleaner it is than the left side. So hopefully that helps. On a bigger sheet, you might have bigger air bubbles, or depending what paper you use. So, you know, spend some time at this. I don't know, maybe it takes me another 10 minutes to push everything out. But Yeah, just take it slow, get some of those air bubbles out. Sometimes you really can't get them out, and in that case, it's okay to just let them be. But just with that in our practice sheet, it's looking pretty good. We almost got all of them out. And just like that, I would say we are okay to move on to the next phase. So, next phase. Let's talk about that really quick. You can either just let it dry overnight, or you can do something faster and grab a hair dryer. So, we can use a hair dryer to quickly dry our sheet of paper. Now, I just recommend this on smaller sheets if you're testing, and this way you can test multiple sheets very, very quickly, right? So maybe you messed this one up a little bit. Instead of completely letting it go, just dry it off, practice cutting it out, and try again. On a larger sheet, this can kind of cause uneven drying, or you might even not get all of it all the way, so I would not use this on a larger sheet. And on the topic of uneven drying, even though the paper looks dry, MC has just a slight curing time, so the paper might feel dry to the touch, but I would honestly leave it overnight or just to the next day to guarantee that it's fully dry and that the paper is fully treated before cutting and removing it. And here we are with a mostly dried paper, and I used the blow dryer to show exactly what I mean, right? So obviously this is a test sheet, so it's okay that it's messed up and warped, but because it dried unevenly, we have now these kind of ridges in the paper, and part of it is just now not stuck onto our cutting mat. You know, we don't want that in our final sheets, but again, for testing purposes, this is okay. Now, this warping doesn't always just happen from blow drying. It can happen normally as well. You'll notice in drying that sometimes a corner might lift up, and then around it, everything starts to wrinkle out and become uneven. This is where I'm going to help troubleshoot this issue for you. Now, if you're having issues with your paper warping like this, I recommend you add a little bit of PVA or just white glue to your MC mix when you treat paper. Now, it's not going to be a lot, just a very little amount, because if you use too much, you're going to have the opposite problem. Your paper is going to be stuck to the surface and impossible to peel off. And that's much worse because you'll basically tear the paper while taking it off the sheet. At least here we can still cut it and use it. But get a little bit of this, a little bit of glue, just a bit, and you'll have yourself a nice even sheet. Now, a lot of times this issue can depend on where you live as well. Humidity can greatly affect the drying time of paper, and also if it wrinkles or comes off a surface. So once again, most of the time you can fix that using this PVA trick. Just add a little bit to your mixture and it'll help stick onto the surface. It also differentiates for paper as well. Oftentimes tissue papers, you might not need this or it'll get way too stuck, but for some thicker handmade papers, it works just fine. And for comparison, I am going to retreat one of these papers on this side and just leave it to dry naturally, add a little bit of the PVA into our MC, and you can kind of see the difference between a nicely treated paper and a warped paper. All right, so we are back, and as you can see, both papers are now dry. There's a huge difference between the one we blow dried and the one that we let naturally dry. And I think this gives us a lesson on some cases. Obviously, it's okay to test, so if you need to do it fast, you can blow dry it. However, it wrinkles and letting it dry naturally works a lot better. Now, in terms of troubleshooting issues, even if you let it naturally dry, your paper might end up looking like this. And there could be a variety of issues based on like your climate, your humidity, just the temperature that it's drying in. So generally, here are some things you want to focus on. If your paper is turning out like this when you're naturally drying it, there's a good chance it could be like really humid in your climate, or just that your surface isn't, binding the MC to it as much, and therefore the edges are starting to lift up. And again, that starts to warp as the edges dry faster with it raised. Since there's more airflow, it's going to warp the paper from the parts that are still wet, and you get this whole effect. So when you're applying MC, you want to be really careful to apply it evenly on the edges. And again, that card technique we are using will help even distribution as you're pushing it out through the edges. Other thing to pay attention to is adding PVA, the same trick I mentioned. You know, if it's really lifting off the paper, like maybe mine's still a little bit stuck on, but yours might have completely lifted off, then really experiment with different ratios of white glue and PVA added into your MC, which is, again, is a great tip in practicing first so you can get your ratio down. Other things to consider, maybe you left your drying out in the sun. You know, that could have accidentally heated up the rubber mat too much and caused some kind of warping. A whole lot of different varieties, but in general, best way to go is natural dry. Kind of leave it in a cool area, and then if your climate is humid, or if your surface, right, if you're treating on something like your floor, a tile, you know, maybe it's a door or wood or anything, you might need some PVA to help keep it stuck down. Just be careful not to use too much, because if it's super stuck to the surface and impossible to remove, then you've ruined your paper as well. So hopefully some of those tips help you troubleshoot if your paper is ending up like this. And, you know, your first couple ones, it might be like this. The paper's not wasted. I'm still going to show how I'm cutting out the paper, and it's still very foldable. But, of course, we like our perfect flat papers, and they'll become a near perfect square once we chop it out, which is our next step. And now it's time to cut our square. We're going to have quite an easy time because of our cutting board, right? It has these nice squares. We've lined it up so that we can just measure a straight line along the references and chop. Now, this is, again, going to be your best investment in origami if you choose to get yourself a cutting board. And oftentimes I recommend a much larger one so that you can make big squares. If you, for some reason, right, can't purchase a cutting board where you live, or you know, you just can't get one yet, that's totally okay. You can make your own grid on anything to make yourself a cutting board. So before I had a nice cutting board like this, I just had a sheet of cardboard, and I drew my own grid along that cardboard, and it was basically the same thing. You know, I couldn't treat the paper on it, but I still had an easy time lining up the paper. You know, you would just have to hold it down a little bit more while you chop it. So if you don't have a cutting board yet, or you can't get one yet, try drawing your own grid. All you need for that really is one straight edge, or ideally two. That makes it a little bit easier. And then a pen. But let's get to cutting. There are some tricks to cutting out the square nicely, even on our perfect grid. In general, right, I'm going to chop this one first. You can see that the area I'm going to chop for the square is under the, you know, ruler. What happens sometimes is if your knife gets dull and it slips, you don't want to be cutting your nice paper on this side. So it's a lot safer to just line it up towards the bottom. And that way, if you accidentally slip or mess up, one, you don't chop into the nice paper that you have. And two, when you actually lift the paper off to remove it, you can just get rid of some of this excess early. And it's a little bit easier and accessible to cut the rest of the square out. So I recommend that. You know, sometimes if you're cutting a large square, you have no choice to cut like this. But again, it's really sad if you accidentally cut through your paper, you know, once it's all dry and nice. But yeah, let's get these squares cut out. I'm just going to chop the other edges. I don't think I really have to explain too much. You saw how I did that one. And we'll come right back. And here we are with our squares. Now, I left the last part of the top unpeeled because I want to show you one more trick. And that's if your paper is more stuck on. As you can see, when I'm peeling it, this part is kind of already lifting, but this part is stuck on. And in order not to ruin your corners, what I like to do is I take my blade, but on the dull side, and I just use it to slide up a corner for myself to grab very carefully. You know, you don't want to scratch yourself. Or it looks like this one lifted up, and that way it's going to be a lot easier for me to peel. But other than that, this sheet already seems kind of loose, so nothing crazy to do but to peel it upwards. Sometimes you get a really satisfying peel if it's more stuck on. And again, if you did add PVA to your MC, it's probably going to be a little bit more stuck than what I showed. But here we are. We got 2 sheets. I think they ended up being like 14 or 13 centimeters. I think this one's 15 centimeters and the other one's 14, just a little bit smaller. But even though one of them is warped, it's still very usable. I can test fold something, you know, pretty intermediate with that one. And then we have a beautiful sheet of 15 centimeter here. So that is the gist of making, or at least treating, paper. And now I'm going to show it to you in big scale, but we're going to kind of speed run the steps just to kind of go over what we learned. All the various tips, but for a real trial. So let's treat a full sheet of this mulberry paper. First thing to do is to clean our cutting board. And don't forget your beanie or hat. Next, let's grab our paper and roll it up. Now we can treat our cutting board. And my MC is more white because I added PVA. Next step is to very carefully roll our paper onto our cutting board. And immediately after that, I used the paint roller to flatten it out. Now we're going to apply MC to the paper. And very carefully use the paint roller to spread it out over the paper. And don't forget the edges are really important, so don't forget to treat it completely. And I like to clean up the excess MC with a paper towel. After waiting 5-ish minutes, it's time to push out the air bubbles with our gift card. Another troubleshooting tip is when the paper is like half dry, you can cover the edges with your metal ruler and your PVC pipe to keep them from lifting. Once the paper is dry, we can cut it out. Now notice I am bracing the metal ruler with my foot to keep it even. For the last cut, it's important to measure twice and cut once to make sure it's a square. Lastly, you can use your knife to gently lift the paper so that you can peel it off the mat. And that's our paper treatment speedrun. And we have our beautiful finished treated square of mulberry paper. Now, we have our big sheet here, but with the scraps, I also cut them out into small squares. And sometimes, depending on the sheet, you can even get as large as a 30 centimeter square from your scraps. So make sure you also cut those out, because why not? Don't waste paper. And that wraps up this video on the tips and tricks to treating your own paper. But there's a lot more involving paper treatment. So what's next? Well, there's going to be multiple videos coming after this covering double tissue, making papers with multiple colors, dyeing the paper, and even making paper that's larger than your cutting board surface or whatever you have to treat paper with. And I think those topics are always very requested from me, so I'm excited to share that with you on how I approach them. But this video is going to be the base information you need to know to also watch those other videos. So if there's any other topics that I've missed or you have questions about, please let me know in the comments, and then I'll probably be making those videos afterwards. But I really hope that this video helped you a lot, gave you some, insight and some tips to make your paper as easily and also affordably as possible, so that you don't have to buy all these random equipment. You kind of have an idea of what you need, what to do, and just make some great origami paper. Now for some of the materials, it's going to differ how to get them depending on where you live. So check out the obb.design/skill issue quiz to see if I've listed a resource or a link for your region of the world for either paper or cutting boards and whatnot. And if not, then let me know and I'll try to help find some for you and then just add them to the skill issue quiz. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Again, let me know in the comments if you have other questions or, just want to let me know that I helped you. And feel free to check out the OBB membership and you can get a little bit more insight on some of these next videos coming up. I'm excited to make them for you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.
All this origami, all this origami, all this origami got me going kamikaze now.